I've been designing roller coasters in No Limits 2 for pretty much 2.5 years, and I've made some good stuff during that time, as well as some stuff that is not so good. So today I'm going to count down the 10 best and 10 worst roller coasters I've made in No Limits 2. This was the first video on the channel, and while the ride has some realistic moments, there are a few elements that RMC has never used, and they don't really feel very RMC-like. And there are also some elements that are way too forceful, and some sections that are way too drawn out, so the pacing just feels really weird in some spots. I'm really happy with the layout on this one, but the reason that it isn't higher on the list is because some of the shaping on the elements either feels a little too jerky or a little too drawn out. Plus, the video is very low quality for some reason, which probably makes me like the ride less without even thinking about it. This ride actually has some solid moments with the drop, dive loop, step up, and the roll through the tunnel, but after that it takes kind of an unrealistic turn. It has this really snappy outer bank, and then the rest of the layout is literally a circle, which looking back on it is kinda lame. The elements are just a random selection of modern Vekoma elements, and then the ride ends with a corkscrew and then a zero-G roll that rotates in the same direction as the corkscrew, so not really sure what I was thinking there. I just really like this layout because unlike a few other of my creations, it doesn't feel like it is too long of a ride with maybe too many elements. I'm really happy with the contrast of the very twisted drop followed by the straight drop off of the turnaround, and then a bunch of crazy but not unrealistic inversions. This was my first attempt at a dive coaster in No Limits, and while the first half isn't really that bad, the second half is a swing and a miss. The shaping on the mid-course drop is off, as well as the following dive loop, which feels more like the first half of a batwing on an aero coaster. Really, the choice of elements and the sequencing of elements aren't that bad, but this was before I really cared about element shaping, and you can kind of see that here. Like the previous on the good list, I don't feel like this ride has too many elements, but the elements that it does have flow really well. The non-inverting pretzel knot here fits very well in the layout, I think. I do think that the Velocicoaster style outer bank in the second half is a little too snappy, and the barrel roll is too smooth, but other than that, I think this ride came out really well. This ride does have some good moments like the dueling elements right after the turnaround, but there are some elements where it's like, what was I doing? The end of the blue track has some really strange sequencing with a slow zero-G roll and then this weird herky-jerky inversion kind of thing. And then there's this double inverting roll that feels very forced, like it was just crammed into the layout for the sake of having more inversions. Then there's this weird outer banked turnaround that also feels pretty forced. The reason it is not higher on the bad list is because the orange side is actually good. The dueling elements are realistic and the shaping isn't that bad. For this one, I spent a ton of time on the terrain and the scenery, and I think it really paid off. The layout is solid and realistic for a mock roller coaster, but the terrain interaction is what puts this in the top 10 for me. I really like the dives into the river as well as the airtime-filled trek back to the station, which is reminiscent of the sharp final hills on DC Rivals. I kinda like the step up into the double zero-G roll and then a step down. I think that's kinda nice, but the rest of the ride is just a bunch of inversions crammed into the layout. There are a couple of generic outer banked hills where the shaping is really drawn out and it doesn't even feel like an RMC at some points. The inversion here, I was going for something like Steel Vengeance's second inversion, and yeah, it did not really come out that way. And then the final inversion is just in there for the purpose of listing another inversion for the stats. The brake run setup is also pretty weird too. This is easily my best Intamin Mega Coaster. The drop and first hill are a bit generic, but then there's that fake-out non-inverting Cobra roll that surprises you at the end with an outer bank to drop. After that, there's the Velocicoaster-esque twister section, which fits really well in the middle of the ride. And then the return run is just the perfect length for a not too long but not too short Mega Coaster. This ride isn't necessarily bad, it's just really short, really generic, and the layout itself didn't require much effort. I do like the support structure on the top hat, and of course in real life this ride would be awesome, but in terms of an innovative layout and good elements, this ride does not compete with the others that I have made. While this ride does have some moments that are a bit too intense and rapid fire, overall I really am happy with how this layout ended up. The first half is a showcase of RMC's best standout elements, and then the second half has a lot more small and rapid fire airtime moments with wave turns, bunny hills, off-axis hills, and a Steel Vengeance-like finale. I do think that the double up in the second half should be much more drawn out, but other than that, this ride is up there with the best that I've done. This coaster was really just thrown together because I didn't have anything to post at that moment, so a lot of it is just kind of a mess. The first half actually isn't that bad, with an overbank turn, this weird off-axis hill, and a couple of switchback transitions. But after that, it kind of falls apart. There's this bland turnaround with an airtime hill, turn, airtime hill, and then a completely unnecessary brake run. It does a turnaround and then a couple of airtime pops before the brakes. The forces are solid, but the layout and element sequencing feel very random. This ride concept itself is definitely the best that I've done, with the extended reverse section during the swing launch, but the element shaping is the reason why it isn't higher. At this point I was really just getting used to FVD, so some of the elements have some unrealistic shaping. Elements in the first half feel kind of janky because of that, and some parts don't feel like something Intamin would make, even though these elements are directly taken from Intamin's coasters. But overall, the concept is really cool, and the ride is insanely long. I was gonna make this Hall of Fame park thing into a series, but that just did not work out, because I realized that I would need to improve designing coasters with FVD a lot before I made more of these. The RMC was the last coaster that I hand-built in No Limits 2, and needless to say, I didn't go off on a high note. The first half of this ride is actually decent, but the pacing is interrupted with this awkward off-axis hill here. After the cutback, I should have just ended the ride with a return run of airtime hills, but instead I put in a brake run and started another section of the ride with not nearly as much speed as I would have needed. As a result, the ride crawls through the selection of elements, all of which feel unnecessary and forced. For the entire second half of the ride, it just keeps going when it really should have ended a while ago. While this ride is admittedly a little too long and the brake run is not long enough, I can look past that because the layout is one of my best. It features a lot of elements that RMC are known for, but it doesn't feel generic because it added a few unique elements that RMC hasn't put on any of their coasters, but they still feel like something that RMC would do. I'm talking about the outer banked hill after the drop and step up, and that turnaround after the stall. Of course, you can't forget the double barrel roll down drop off the second lift. This ride is super long, but it doesn't feel repetitive because there's new stuff throughout the entire ride. This was another one of the first coasters I published on this channel, and it's not one of my better ones, to say the least. The first part isn't that bad with a drop, airtime hill, and a turnaround. After this is an outer banked hill that isn't banked nearly enough. After that's an airtime hill and a turn, followed by this strange outer banked hill. The train turns back around through a speed hill before a weird double up into the mid-course, which is not really anything Intamin would ever do on an actual coaster. Even worse, it turns off the brakes and does pretty much the same thing back down. After that are two way too strong airtime hills that are also way too steep for this part of the ride, so the train just looks really awkward flying over these hills. It just randomly turns left into a really forceless bump and then a couple of back and forth turns into the brakes. Not one of my better layouts there. It is ironic that this is not at the top spot, but is by far the best of my Intamin Blitz coasters. The only problem is that this ride seems to traverse the layout a little too quickly because the ride appears much slower in the designing stage in FVD than it does when filming in No Limits 2. Other than that, the layout is pretty much perfect for a modern Blitz coaster, especially the second half of the ride. This was me attempting to build a GCI wooden coaster, and the result was a random jumble of turns and a few airtime hills that don't really resemble a GCI at all. I did attempt to make a pop of airtime entering and exiting a few turnarounds, but the shaping is way off. Later in the ride, there's also this very weird unbanked turning hill. I'm not really sure what I was thinking there. The whole layout doesn't resemble a GCI at all. If I was shown this and had to guess the manufacturer, I would probably go with a Gravity Group, which is a problem because in real life there are many very noticeable differences between the styles and element choices of the two manufacturers. My favorite of the No Limits 2 coasters that I have made is Chiller, an RMC hybrid I made back in October of 2021. It has this wildfire-like turnaround after the lift hill before a 200-foot drop. After that are a collection of RMC's best standout elements, with a Zadra-inspired twisted hill and turnaround before a low-to-the-ground fast-paced death roll from Iron Gwazi. The rest of the layout is filled with wave turns, double-ups, bunny hills, and a well-sequenced collection of airtime moments thrilling riders until the brakes. If you enjoyed this video, make sure that you are subscribed, and also check out my playlist of No Limits 2 coasters.